Let's finish up the brand website's authorization with Jason Taylor's flexible authorization project. This work of art includes roles, permissions, and policies. I will use the standard officially documented built-in .NET 8 and Blazor authentication and authorization mechanisms, since that's likely the most useful approach for you. I'll make sure to publish both the standard approach and my adapted modular approach to my Patreon. My custom approach will only slightly deviate from the standard approach, and those differences will only be in the Blazor frontend. But let's start where we left off in the last video, which was authentication in Blazor, and role-based authorization was also already possible. I'll briefly talk about the shortcomings of role-based authorization and then go over into policy-based authorization before I touch the flexible authorization, which uses both. I highly recommend to, after this video of course, check out the original GitHub repository of Jason Taylor, and the Jason Taylor talks about the subject. So what I want to achieve is something like Patreon itself, and that is a member section where you can have different levels of access, but so similarly like roles, but those roles or access levels are not set in stone. They are not hard coded into the project. You can add those and remove those and so on. Let's take a look at my Patreon, which is found on patreon.com/GitStupid. And a special thanks for the already 3 members that are supporting the YouTube channel. This means a lot to me and my family and motivates me to keep going and build even more and better projects for you. So you see all of these posts. And there are memberships, that's in my native language, sorry for that. But you can easily add a level or a membership level and edit them, remove them, and so on. This does not imply that the development team of Patreon has to then dive into the code base and change all of their conditional logic based on the levels I add and delete. That's all quite dynamic and flexible. So if I would go to that same Patreon page where you can find all of my work as a non-authenticated, non-authorized user, you would see so the membership. And then most of the things are locked. Most of the things are free, but you need to have a Patreon account. And then some things are exclusive to the member levels. So that's basically what I want to achieve in my brand website as well. I have specified the roles. I want to have access to this content. And in the nav menu, I added some roles as well, administrator and manager. And I could keep going for every component I want to lock behind certain roles. What happened here is the first thing I already mistyped, so I accidentally put managers, which wouldn't work. Also, having to duplicate or specify all of the roles each time all over your code base is going to take quite some maintenance to update, to test and so on. And what I find very unfortunate about this approach is we keep having to repeat all of the roles that have access instead of being able to imply that the administrator has all of the access, so all of the moderator access, and the moderator might have all of the managerial access, and the manager might have more access than the visitor. So it would be easier to just specify a visitor and then have all of the access levels above also be able to access this. You could achieve that with some custom code. For example, roles with admin access, only the admin. Roles with moderator access are the admin and the moderator. Roles with company access are the admin, and then all of the roles that also have that access. And you could specify some simple methods. Has admin access, so only the admin users. Has moderator access, so the users with the admin role and with the moderator role, and so on. You could also accomplish that by using the out-of-the-box approach of .NET by specifying policies in the add authorization. So elevated rights, for example, require multiple roles, so administrator, moderator, manager, whatever you say, and that could then maybe be named has manager access. And then you could use those policies on the, like specified above, on the methods, on the API endpoints. But to also have these policies active on your Blazor frontend, you'd have to specify, so duplicate these into your frontend project. And then you could simply, instead of the roles, you could use the policy and then use that name as manager access. That is slightly better, slightly more maintainable, but it's still hard-coded all over the project. So you'd still have to update these policies and redeploy your project and so on. So instead of hard coding roles or policies and using those all over the project, we're going to use permissions. Under the hood, these will be dynamically generated policies. These permissions on the left, so view, manage roles, view, manage users, view, manage permissions, can then be given to the roles. And after that, the user with one of these roles can access that specific feature or functionality in your application. You can make this as fine-grained as you want. But typically, these permissions are more tied to the feature and to the action that the user can take rather than some role. Which makes a lot of sense for this brand website, since we have these feature modules. Since I can then specify that create blog post is another permission than viewing a blog post. So the blog post code will then contain checks on that permission, so view or manage blog post, which makes more sense than administrator or moderator access. And I can then decide that one day the visitor can also edit the blog posts or take permissions away. So that's way more flexible, and I don't have to take out hard-coded role checks all over the code. So let's see that in action. Let's say I add a test role, create, and then the test role came along. And now I just have to trigger a re-render, so I'm gonna do that. You see the test role, so I could say all or none, manage users maybe, view permissions. So that's pretty cool. So now a user with the test role can manage the users, view the permissions, but maybe tomorrow I decide to change that and just say you can only view the users and none of the other things. And it's simple as that. I don't have to go into the code and change a lot of things. I just have to manage it right here. What does need to happen, of course, is that user with the test role needs to, well, their access token will likely contain that permission at that time. Current access token has to expire before that change in permission is active. And I can easily take that role away again. Let's see, I have to re-render. So I can add roles, delete roles, update roles without having to change the code, and the permissions will remain intact. So that's pretty flexible, pretty dynamic. I had to seed those users and those roles into the database, so let's take a look at that first. In previous video, roles were already supported, an identity, but I made another custom role entity which inherits from identity role, so the standard one, and I added a few fields to know more about the creation of it, and then this permissions. But to use this role, we have to alter the identity DB context to have that custom user model, custom role model, and the string is basically the type of the primary key. And then I added the seeder to seed some users and roles. So for roles, that's our custom role entity instead of the identity role. I added a few users, so the admin, the manager, and the visitors, and then which user with which role. I had to add roles, our custom role, and then of course I added in the migrations. Let's go back to that permissions property, which has a type of permissions, which is actually an enum, an enumeration with the flags. And you see the permissions specified in here with a value with the power of 2, so 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, which could be seen as 0001, 0010, 00100, and so on. And then the all is the inverse of none. So we're not going to use these permissions merely for representation. We're going to actually calculate with these. You can calculate. So permission A plus C would be, so you can do calculations and the outcome will be a unique value, and that unique value represents a combination of permissions. So you can have a lot of permissions and those will just be summed up into a single integer value, which then represents all of the permissions you have. So if you would console log these as string, you would really see A, B, C, D, E as permissions. So for us, it would be view roles, manage roles, view users, manage users. And you can also output these as integers, which we'll use to store into the database. And you can use bit operators to add permissions together or to subtract permissions. So adding permissions would be with the logical OR operator. So adding permissions B to the user's permissions is with this pipe and equals. Removing permission is with this symbol, the XOR operator. And you can use this AND operator to get the difference in permissions. So if these would result in 0, then that would mean there's no overlap in permissions, which means you're not authorized. If there is overlap between the required and the user's permissions, then you are authorized. That means the user has one or more of the permissions that are required. And to specify those required permissions, you can simply use this pipe operator and say the required permissions are either A or B. So if the user has any of these, you are authorized. So using that, you could use that within the authorize attribute instead of the role name or the policy name. And this is where the on-the-fly policy generation comes in. So with a prefix of permissions followed by the integer value of the actual permissions. So A and B would be 3. So permissions 3 would then be the policy to protect an endpoint or a view. So instead of the policy name has manager access or has visitor access, this will now be permission and then the sum, well, the integer representation of that permission, or the integer representation of the sum of those permissions. And then the user will get a claim with the value of also permissions and then the integer, which represents either the permission or the sum of permissions that that user has. So instead of using the user's roles or the role claims, we're now using a custom claim with a permission policy value. Let's log in with visitor. And then I see permissions 5. If I go to the admin page, I can see the users. I can see the roles, but I cannot add a new role. And then the manage permissions we can also not see because we only have the view users and the view roles permissions. The GitHub repository of Jason Taylor. And then we're interested in the flexible auth. So the permissions notebook was what I just showed you, and now the flexible auth. Let's go in there and we see a shared folder, server and client. In my project, that would mean the underscore shared, the API and the Blazor frontend. There's a lot in here, so it's quite daunting to start with this project, but that's why I'm making the video, of course. I'm going to start with the server on the program CS. And then you see some database stuff. And then you see some more. So we saw that, add roles. We see a claims principal factory, which we'll see later. Then we see some stuff for identity server, which we can ignore since we're not using that. We can also ignore that. Partly, we'll have to add authentication to our Blazor pre-render server, unfortunately, and add the bearer token authentication. And we're only interested in these two lines, the authorization handler, permission handler, and the flexible policy provider. And that will likely live in the shared project, since in the frontend project you'll also need to register these. And let's start with the API. So we have the extensions CS in our authentication module, since this is a class library. And that's where I added these handlers and providers. And I also added this claims principal factory. But let's look at this one first. And this inherits from the authorization handler with the permission authorization requirement. This one is basically just a collection of data parameters that a policy can then use to evaluate on. So let's say this was a requirement to check the age of a user, so the minimum required age, then this would just contain an integer property with the age, and then in the handler we would do checks whether that user is over the minimum required age. So that's basically what we're doing in here. We're targeting the claim that holds the permission, and when there is a valid one, we're just checking if we're authorized, which means there's overlap between the user permissions and the acquire permissions, and then we're authorized. In all other cases, if there's no valid permissions, then we just do nothing, we just exit. So this handler just evaluates whether the user has sufficient permissions. And in here you also see that we're trying to get the integer value from the claims, and we're casting those back to the permissions enumeration to then work with those to the checks. Let's take a look at the next one, the flexible authorization policy provider, which is basically making those policies on the fly. And it's first checking, do we already have a policy with the name, for example, permissions 5. If not, we're making one and we're registering that policy to our app. And this policy name helper is basically just translating permissions to policy names and vice versa. To actually get this custom permission claim in our identity, we'll have to add this custom user claims principal factory, and we actually only have to do that in the backend, since the backend is going to generate the bearer token. So that's basically what that claims factory does. It's getting all the roles of the user and summing up all of the permissions to get the total of permissions for that user, and then adding that as a claim to the bearer token to the user claims principal. So that was all for the backend setup. So now we can protect our API endpoints with. So I added some endpoints. So the identity endpoints is what you saw before, and then I added the roles and the users endpoints, which I have not protected yet, but you could simply say require authorization, and then you pass in the stringified version, the policy name, the roles, whatever. You could even, and that's where this policy helper, name helper comes in, generate policy name for, and then we could pass in permissions dot, let's say, view users or manage users, for example. And that's then going to result in the policy name of permissions with the integer sum of 4 and 8, so 12. I think we can just use the authorize attribute and then specify the permissions the same way. So what was it again? View users. Well, we're in the roles, so roles would make more sense. And manage roles. I'm not sure if I'm doing it correctly. Yeah, and that's where Mr. Taylor has made another authorize attribute. It's not using the default one, since the default one does not support passing permissions there. So let's take a look at the attribute Mr. Taylor made for us. Living in the shared project, authorize attribute. So basically inheriting from the standard attribute, has some constructors. You can also pass the policy name, but you can also pass the permissions. And this will basically translate the permissions to a policy name. So we can use this attribute in both in the backend as in the frontend to protect our endpoints or our pages with those permissions. So what else do we have in here? We saw the attribute, we saw the flexible policy provider, we saw the authorization handler, and the requirement, and even the policy name helper we've seen as well, and the permissions itself, which holds the permissions, and an extra method which is only used in the front end to display those permission names. Yeah, I made an admin state and admin HTTP client simply to separate out the users, the roles stuff. So what we saw before with the authorized view of Blazor out of the box, that could only have a policy name, or Mr. Taylor made a flexible authorized view, but similar like the authorized attribute, which inherits from the standard authorized view, well, translates the permissions into a policy. And to simply check whether there's an overlap in permission, you can also use the hash flag. And underneath we see, so we're initializing the roles just to have that table of checkboxes with the roles and the permissions. And then whenever I click on such a checkbox, we're calling this update role permission. So to update the permission of that specific role doing that HTTP client, but first we need to either grant or revoke those permissions. So add permissions or take permissions away. So that would go as follows with those operators that we saw before. What was it? The OR and the XOR. Let's take a look at the admin page. And you can of course specify multiple. So if the user has any of these permissions.manage users. But that's where the fine graining comes in. So you could, for example, say on the page, you can use that attribute and say authorize. So you need to have the view, maybe admin or view users permission to access the page. And then down below to actually interact with this table, maybe we only want the ones that also have the manage users permission. Then for the roles table, the roles permission, then you have the delete role button, which should actually also be wrapped in one of these flexible authorized views. And then we have the fine graining of managing roles, so adding roles that specifically needs to manage roles permission. So that's all very useful, the fine graining. I would say it's more useful in an admin panel than in an just a front-end project that I'm working in right now. But it's very flexible. Look. Permissions 31. Let's see what that is. So view the users, manage the roles, and view and manage the roles. So we can also add roles, but we cannot manage the permissions. We can only view the permissions. See, can't click because only the administrator has the manage permissions. So we're now ready for organizational changes. A change in staff, let's say some new people come in, some new developers or some new managers or some new this or that functions. They can just get roles, get permissions, and we don't have to change anything in the code. However, if we add features, so maybe the products, we might have to go into the code base to add those permissions. View products, manage products, and so on. So that's still hard-coded. There might be a way to also store these permissions into the database, but then you'll have to likely load them at app startup. I'll have to investigate what the implications are from that, what the possibilities are there. I might want different permission sets per module even. Or maybe different permission sets per application. Let's say for the administrator application, you want a different set of permissions than for the web shop, for example. So does every project need this? No, of course not. If you just want to protect a few endpoints or a few views with one or two roles, then role-based or policy-based might be more than sufficient for most of the applications. If you do have a lot of changes in access levels or roles or these kind of things, and you don't want to have to go into the code base, redeploy each time, then this might be a very good solution for your project. So I'm going to at least try to make some kind of member section with this, and it makes a lot of sense for me to have permissions per module, per feature, rather than having those roles all over the code base. I'll end the video right here. I will publish this code to my Patreon, and I'll publish my other adapted more module approach as well, which will only deviate a little bit in the front end. And I'll say it again, I highly recommend you to watch Jason Taylor's talks about this subject, and his blog posts even, and his GitHub repository. I forgot to show one thing in our project in the pre-render server. I had to add this add authentication and add bearer token. And that's also part of the reason why I'll stick with my adapted modular approach, because I want to minimize the amount of places that I have to add or modify code to make this authentication module work, since this needs to be relatively easily plug and playable. If you like this video, don't forget to let me know by hitting that like button, and make sure to subscribe, because there are some more videos to come for this series. And I'll make sure to publish the code into Patreon. This version will also contain some bug fixes that I accidentally introduced in my last version, which is the ones you see on screen. So, and this version contains the ability to manage roles and permissions and much more.